Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas, and as always, you can follow us on our Facebook page. Our website is Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and a YouTube channel with our archives on it. Our next guest, we're going to continue into some area that we just got to towards the end of our visit with Chris Horner. Robert Stilson is on with us from the Capital Research Center. He is one of their research specialists, and we're going to get into the perhaps least paid attention to three letters in our public policy, which probably are the most important. And I'm not talking about FBI. I'm talking about ESG. Robert, thank you for taking some time out with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on.
So we were talking about this a little bit in the previous segment, talking about ESG and the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really just a green agenda with some health care thrown in for flavor. And it struck me that years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that you could be taxed for not doing something. Ostensibly, not buying health insurance meant you had to pay a tax to the government. Is there an expansion of this? We see the energy police in this bill, funding for what it seems to be an energy enforcement division, never mind the 87,000 new IRS agents. Is this all going to be turning the ESG into ostensibly an FBI operation?
Yeah, so I think it's important so ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. So that's it's basically criteria for evaluating a corporation on non-financial criteria, right? So, and they're often politically relevant criteria. So a lot of times you'll hear ESG being talked about as a means to politicize corporations. And I don't know if that's always the case, but I think it's the case enough that that's a fair criticism. So there's a number of problems with ESG. And I think it's helpful to think about ESG both on the investing and the activism side, right? So you have ESG investing, where you're selecting investments based on one of these non-financial, often political criteria. Mm-hmm. That's been around a long time. And then more problematic even than that is ESG activism, what I call ESG activism, where you have individuals, foundations, nonprofits, and now even government, putting the thumb on the scale and trying to trying to achieve political objectives and certainly divisive ideological objectives through the power of corporations. And that's certainly, I think, quite problematic.
Well, we just saw, I think the SEC was taking public comment on ESG regulations, Securities and Exchange Commission, and that seems to be what you're talking about is it's gone from just, hey, here are some environmentally friendly companies. If you want to invest with them, it's your choice, into here come the regulators saying, no, you will have to pay more if you want to invest in somebody that doesn't get a high ESG score or something like that.
Yeah, that SEC regulations are really important piece to talk about, because that's a great example of putting the thumb on the scale from government. So what that regulation does, for folks who aren't familiar, the proposed regulation, I should say, is it's going to require public companies to report on their greenhouse gas emissions, their transition plans, and it's going to require this in annual reports. And, the objective, or at least what a lot of these activist groups, these environmental activist groups, think that will do is sort of pressure, disfavor, you might say, traditional energy companies in a way that doesn't pressure other companies. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing the public comments on those right now, and there's a lot of questions whether this regulation is going to hold up in court, of course, but the public comments are really aggressive on trying to get the SEC to go even further with this, not strengthen the rule. And so that's an example of just how coordinated this ESG activist campaign is through that regulation, and then other ones we've seen from the Department of Labor and other sources.
Is there a danger? I guess that's maybe a silly question, because there's always a danger that once the precedent has been set that we can do this to a company, and certainly what you're describing is going to create an even less competitive marketplace for anything and less innovative, because small companies won't be able to handle the cost of compliance with the SEC regulations, and therefore they don't compete. So therefore the big companies that are, the legacy companies, the Dominion Energies, et cetera, ExxonMobil, they just get to keep on doing whatever it is the government, lobbyists have told them, yeah, you can get away with that. And of course, none of it actually cleans the environment any more than we already had to this point, Robert. But can this then, at some point, and this is the chilling part to me, is then this starts to get extrapolated into social credit scores. And, if you haven't invested in the right companies, well, then your taxes are going to be this. There probably would start as tax breaks for investing in it, and then it starts to become penalized citizenry for not investing in these green companies. I could see where this is going.
Yeah, I think something to that along those lines might be what some of these ESG activists envision as an endgame, but even more fundamentally, just if we're talking about our democracy, I'm going to paraphrase Vivek Ramaswamy, who wrote a great book on this issue last year and has been influential in my thinking on the issue. It's good. We allow corporations to become very powerful in our society because of how profound the benefits of free market capitalism are. They shareholder values created, consumers get good products, employees get good jobs. But because they're so powerful, we need to keep them separate from our democratic institutions, right? We need to enact our societal values through our government, through our democratic institutions, and in the same way we don't want government putting its thumb on the scale and influencing our business, we don't want our business influencing political issues. Because if they do, then it becomes far too powerful, and it creates a huge problem, just not only for free market capitalism, but for our democracy, our constitutional government.
And it certainly turns us against each other in new and previously unheard of ways. Robert Stilson is research specialist with the Capital Research Center. We're talking about ESGs, where we are now with them, where it looks like we're going with them. And during the 2020 Democratic primary, there was a lot of hay made. It was brought up by Andrew Yang, and then Me Too'd by Pete Buttigieg, the idea of democratic capitalism. And everyone was like, "Oh, that sounds mystical." And I said, "Go to any planning commission meeting or any of these boards or commissions that determine zoning commissions and things like that, and you'll see democratic capitalism on there. We all get to vote on what kind of business you have. Perhaps it would be more expanded upon than that. But I said it's ostensibly 3 wolves and 2 sheep voting on what kind of restaurant they're going to permit to open. All in favor of souvlaki, say aye." Woo, and then you get, we don't want souvlaki, but a souvlaki it is. And that's what I see these ESG laws becoming, is this way where, small groups of activists scaring enough politicians to, either stop companies from hiring people, expanding, or just whole cloth shutting them down altogether. This becomes a cudgel for that kind of thing. Is there a danger in that, Robert, in your research?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you mentioned the small groups of activists. I think that's a really important point to focus on here, especially when we get into shareholder activism, which is, we talked about ESG investing and ESG activism, but what if the investors are also activists? And so you have a relatively small group of investors in a company that really want to use that company to promote their desired ideological or political changes. Well, they can do that through shareholder resolutions and file those at the companies and try to get them to a vote at the annual meeting. And it doesn't take a lot of stock to do this. And the impact of that small activist group can be greatly magnified, because what are some of the largest asset managers in the country? BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. These asset managers hold so many shares in these companies that their voting power is completely outsized vis-a-vis anything else. And so if you can get one or more of those asset managers to back your relatively small activist group's proposal, you can magnify your impact way beyond your shareholder influence in the company. So I think that's a really important point.
And we've seen this, especially with BlackRock, where they've taken this role. And you hear it even municipally. You have protests at city council meetings, divest organizations saying, we don't want you to divest in Smith & Wesson or whatever the particular asset class is. And the marketplace can do this. It's just I have always felt like the activists just aren't patient enough for the market to sort itself out, and it's getting more and more so, maybe driven by social media, Robert. Because if the community at large actually doesn't want a product, they'll stop buying it, and eventually they'll stop making it.
That's absolutely right. And fundamentally, these are market distortions, right? Because this is about changing the market, using the power of corporations, or then using the power of government if you're going to go through regulation or something like that to distort the market's demand for things. We see this with the energy industry all the time. The market demands traditional energy sources, but we see either through shareholder activism campaigns, public pressure campaigns, governmental, like we just talked about the SEC regulations. These are attempts to distort free market corporate capitalism to suit ideological agendas. And I think that's fundamentally what ESG activism is.
When we look at our elected officials, and I'm trying to not make this political, especially with the midterms, when we start voting in a few weeks here in Virginia, Robert, so I'm not trying to drag us into, which party, but you really can see both parties saying, well, there's fundraising to be made on this. There's K Street lobbyists that are going to come and wine and dine and celebrate us and contribute to our reelection campaigns. So is there a political solution to this, or is it going to have to be in the courts?
Certainly the courts will look at the regulations that get promulgated. That's important from a just statutory authority perspective, or something like the SEC or one of these other regulations. There could be some political, legislative solutions. I know Senator Rubio proposed one last year that was at this, but fundamentally, I think, because this is such, the activism on ESG has been being driven by investors, even in grassroots level. I think if you're interested in this issue, the most important thing you can do is do what we're doing right here, right now. Talk about it, raise the profile of the issue. Because, if you aren't comfortable with corporations and investments being politicized, say that. Because if these companies and asset managers are only hearing from one side, they're going to gravitate towards that side. And so I think more so than any political solution, it's going to be a grassroots campaign type thing to raise awareness of what's going on, just like what we're doing right now.
Well, it's also important to remember, President Biden, when he had his signing ceremony for the Inflation Exacerbation Act, said, we're creating these jobs and we're creating these industries. And I think that's really the issue. Is this the role of the U.S. constitutionally created government? I know there are governments where that is their role and that's what they do. But as we're written up here, I don't see anything in our rules that say we're supposed to be making companies open jobs or getting rid of these things. So is that one of the cases we need to make, is the role of government case on this?
Absolutely, and I'll give you a good example on that. It's always helpful to look at where, on any issue, it's always helpful to look at where activists are planting stakes on issues, just to see, they can't do this right now, but this is what they see as the future. And on the ESG issue, one of those stakes that's being planted as sort of an ultimate endgame here is something federally chartering corporations.
Oh.
So for any corporation. I've seen this proposed by multiple nonprofits. So even above a certain size, a corporation would have to obtain a federal charter from the United States government that would be subject to all these restrictions, ESG-type restrictions. So you'd need to operate for a social purpose in addition to creating value for shareholders. You need to have a diverse board of directors, a racially or ethnically diverse board of directors. So that's sort of, that's not coming soon, but I mention it to say this is where the end game is for a lot of these activists, and that's why it's important to raise the profile of the issue right now.
So well said, because, a lot of the stuff we're talking about, in Washington now were things that we heard about 10 years ago and said, oh, well, that's never going to happen. And then when John Roberts said, no, I think Congress can tax you for not doing something, you get that kind of aqua velva smack and you say, okay. And so you're right to look at some of the places where maybe they lose in court this time, but they figure out, okay, well, this is what we'll need to do to prove it the next time.
Right, exactly right.
So what, obviously we're talking about fighting these in court sometimes. Is there a way that the listener, obviously supporting the work at the Capital Research Center and the work you do there, but unless you're all ready to go into court, are there lawyers already right now kind of picking up on the briefs that are needed, or are they talking to you at capitalresearch.org saying, okay, what do we need to be ready for when we get before Justice Roberts and the rest of the Supremes?
Right. Well, the Capital Research Center, we're an educational nonprofit, so we're not focused so much on litigation as much as just educating the public on this and many other issues. So as far as what listeners who are interested in this issue could do, I would direct you to, we have a website, obviously our main website is capitalresearch.org, but we also operate influencewatch.org, which is an online encyclopedia of all of the influencers in our politics, and we have a dedicated hub of profiles just on the ESG issue that anybody who's interested in the groups, and I'm talking about nonprofits, asset managers, and others who are active on this issue, please visit that website. There's a tremendous amount of information on funders, activities, and then we've written on this issue. I've written on this issue in many articles for our website too. So that's our objective, is to just educate the public on issues of relevance and who is involved in that activism.
Well, and I know some of our listeners, they flinch because activists will talk about dark money, and they start to get into Citizens United and is money speech and things like that. But if companies like you mentioned BlackRock are out there saying, well, we like this because it benefits us, well, that's usually to the detriment of someone else, which isn't the American economic structure there. So are there any other surprises that people would find there, that the NRA or someone like that you wouldn't expect to see in the ESG list on Influence Watch?
Well, yeah, you mentioned BlackRock. I think that's a great example in terms of who's funding. Where do the assets that BlackRock manage come from? They come from regular people, pension funds, retirement accounts. These are ordinary people's money, and to the extent it's being used as a company to promote ESG outcomes that people might not be aware of, and certainly these are divisive issues that people might not want their money to support. So it's important to, and in fact, just in the Wall Street Journal the other day, there was an editorial about this, about how I think it was 19 state attorneys general reached out to BlackRock about this and said, look, these are the people of our state's money. We don't think what you're doing is in their interest, or at least we're not sure it is. We really need to come to an understanding about this. And in fact, perhaps a better example is the state treasurer of West Virginia just last month basically banned BlackRock and a number of other banks from doing business contracting with the state because of how their environmental, climate change, particularly anti-coal stance, was directly in conflict with the interests of the people of West Virginia. Mm-hmm. So I think that's important to educate people about.
What about your individual, like if you have an asset manager? I mean, I don't want to go all Rick Edelman here, but don't they have a fiduciary responsibility if you're being put into funds that aren't necessarily looking to build your retirement plan to the greatest degree? Isn't it endemic to them to tell you this?
Yeah, they do have a fiduciary responsibility to put your financial interests first, but it's really tricky because just towards the end of last year, early this year, the Department of Labor put out a regulation that actually rescinded a Trump administration era regulation on ERISA plans or pension fund plans, and it said explicitly in this proposed regulation, you have a fiduciary duty to maximize return to shareholders or to beneficiaries, of course, but you can also consider ESG considerations when you're making, investment decisions and making proxy vote decisions. So climate change, diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations. Like they're writing this into the regulation to say this can be part of your fiduciary duty. So that's on the regulatory front. That's being done right now on that very issue.
That's amazing. So it's almost as if they're equating it to a dollar value, saying, well, the climate's better, so that's worth a couple of bucks on somebody's ERA. Can I take that to the grocery store and buy food with it?
That's exactly the argument that's being made. It's a do well by doing good is the phrase you'll often hear from ESG advocates. But I think that overlooks the issue that these are fundamentally divisive issues. It's not divisive. Maximizing returns is not divisive. That's in everybody's interest, no matter what your political or ideological beliefs are. But ESG issues are much different. There's no way an asset manager can say, I'm acting in the benefit of my, beneficiaries by taking this stand on this particular often politically contentious issue. It's fundamentally different, in my opinion.
Is there a concern that the opposite could wind up being punitive? And I know we sort of talked about this at the beginning, but I worry that once we've gotten the proactive approach of rewarding people for ESGs, if you don't participate with companies that do that, is there a danger that the IRS and all these new IRS agents, could be coming after you for violating ESG or ignoring ESG?
I think that's sort of I think that might be the end game for a lot of these activists and even regulators in some respect to try to make this sort of thing mandatory. Like we're seeing with the SEC right now, mandatory disclosures. And these disclosures aren't, in my opinion, of course, aren't truly about providing information to investors. They're about stigmatizing certain industries. I mean, so I think there's absolutely a punitive aspect to that, an unsaid punitive aspect to that, again, in my opinion.
Well, I appreciate your, and it's a better one than mine because you're doing the research. And when you collect all of this stuff, and I presume you have a big corkboard in your office, Robert Stilson at Capital Research Center, well, all the strings connecting all the little photographs there. But however you do it, we appreciate what you do there. And again, it's capitalresearch.org and influencewatch.org. And we really appreciate your time out for us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's a really important issue to be talking about with folks.
Without question. It's not the one that grabs the headlines, but it's the one that's going to grab your bottom line. And thank you very much for tuning in this week to all of this here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, where we dig deeper. We don't chase the headlines. We want to make sure it's about, all I guess the ultimate bottom line is that your freedom to go about how you do things can lead to your prosperity. Find out more about us at virginiainstitute.org. And until next week, on behalf of all of us here, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.